Hi, grade 11s. I hope you're fine. So today we'll be doing gaseous exchange, human gaseous exchange, and this is part one of this unit, and we'll be doing the human respiratory system. So make sure that after watching this video, you go check out the other videos because of they are interlinked, and you have to know. So this is the basics actually. So, today, as I said, we'll be focusing on the human respiratory system, right? So, as you look at the human respiratory system, so today we'll be focusing on the nasal cavity, trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, lungs, alveoli, and the respiratory muscles, right? So, if you can see the diagram, we'll be focusing on the nasal cavity, which is at the beginning. Then we go to the lungs and all that. So yeah, let's get on with today's video. So firstly, we're gonna start with the nasal cavities, right? So when we're talking about the nasal cavity, so if you know what a nasal cavity, you would think of nostrils. Yes. So we have the two external nostrils that lead to two nasal cavities that are separated by a septum, right? So when we're talking about a septum, we're talking about a wall dividing the two nasal passages, right? Then after then we have turbinate bones. So they are curved bones that we can say they swallow air, if you know what I mean. They slow down air, if you I think if you understand that. Yes. Then after then we have a type of cell that is called the ciliated columnar epithelium. If you did grade 10, if you did life sciences in grade 10, because some people change streams, right? So if you did life sciences in grade 10, you know that we have ciliated columnar and epithelium, and this cell type, it contains the mucus and the cilia, which is the tiny hairs, right? You know that, right? So the cilia are the hairs that sweep mucus or dust out. Then they are trapped by mucus that is produced by the goblet cells. Okay? So guys, I feel like yeah. Then after then we have the blood capillaries which warm up incoming air. Okay, then after then we're going to the pharynx. Okay, so the pharynx is a throat area where our nose and our mouth meet. Okay, so the nasal cavities, they open up into the what, into the pharynx, if you know what I mean. Okay, so the pharynx leads to two openings, which are the opening known as the glottis, which leads to the trachea, and the opening that leads to the esophagus. So when we're talking about the glottis, we're talking about the opening to the trachea, right? And when we're talking about the trachea, we're talking about the windpipe for air. If you know, windpipe windpipe is the trachea, right? Then when we're talking about the esophagus, you did it in term 2, where esophagus is the windpipe. Okay, then after then we're moving on to the trachea itself. So when we're talking about the trachea is a long tubular structure located at the front of the esophagus, right? And the trachea, it contains we have the larynx, and the larynx is a voice box with vocal cords, right? The larynx is a voice box with the vocal cords, is located at the top of the trachea. Is that structure, I don't have it on this video, but it is like kind of like a bud, if I know. Yeah, but it's like a bucket. Like, check the structure, you will see it, right? And we have the epiglottis. The epiglottis is at the top of the larynx and consists of cartilage, right? And the epiglottis closes the glottis during the swallowing process and prevents food from entering the trachea. Okay, so when we're talking about the epiglottis, we're talking about the cartilage flap that closes trachea when swallowing. So that's why the food don't enter in your what, in your trachea. But when you eat and chug at the same time, the epiglottis get tired and you eventually choke on your food. So stop doing that. Then after, we're gonna talk about the C-shaped cartilage rings. So the walls of the trachea are supported and kept open by a C-shaped cartilage rings. So the trachea is lined with ciliated columnar epithelial with goblet cells that secrete mucus. Going back to the C-shaped cartilage rings, they keep the trachea open, right? Then the mucus, it moistens the incoming air and trapped dust particles. Mucus is with trapped foreign particles are moved to the through the pharynx through sweeping actions of the cilia, and we talked about this. And it's either you swallow it or you spit it out. I mean, it depends. Now we're going to the bronchi, bronchioles, and alveoli. So you need to know the difference, plural and the singular. Check it out. I'm not gonna talk about those. So in here, the trachea, it branches into two bronchi that enters the right and the left lung, right? So the bronchi is the two tubes from trachea to lungs. They are held by O-shaped cartilages, right? So the bronchi divide into smaller branches inside the lungs and form the bronchioles. So the bronchioles are smaller branches with smooth muscle, and they have no cartilage. You should take note of that, right? Then after, we have the alveoli. So the alveoli is the tiny air sacs where gas exchange happens. Again, so remember, we didn't start the gaseous exchange at the beginning. They're gonna tell they you must do the difference between breathing, gaseous exchange, and what you call cellular respiration. So with that, you know the alveoli, you know where gaseous exchange happens, you know that it happens in the alveoli during the difference and the requirements for efficient gas exchange. You have to know those things, right? And we have the squamous epithelial, as I talked about this in grade 10, that taught you about this. So it's a single thin layer in alveoli for easy gas exchange. So when we mean easy, we mean that it's a requirement, right? So when we make easy, so the gas exchange, we know that it must be thin to ensure rapid diffusion of gases. So this is a requirement for efficient gaseous exchange. So you must actually know it. So we have capillaries, right? So when we're talking about capillaries, I'm sorry, we're talking about tiny blood vessels around alveoli to move either oxygen or carbon dioxide, right? Then going back to the bronchioles, each bronchiole ends in an infundibulum. So this has we don't pronounce it the same. Some pronounce it British, some pronounce it American, but yeah. And this structure, it consists of groups of um alveoli. Now, the millions of alveoli increase the gaseous exchange surface. The walls of the alveoli are thin and consist of a single layer of squamous epithelium, as I said, and these thin walls allow for efficient gaseous exchange. A thin layer of tissue fluid lines the inside surface of the alveoli and keep the surface of the alveoli moist, preventing the cells from drying out. We're gonna dwell too much on this in the we're not talking about gases exchange at alveoli, right? Then capillaries, they transport oxygen to the tissue and carbon dioxide to the lungs. Now the walls of the capillaries are thin and consist of a single layer of squamous epithelial to allow efficient gaseous exchange. Now we're moving on to the lungs, but before we move, let's talk about the structure of them, of everything we were talking about. So if you look at this structure, we have the smooth muscle, we have the bronchi, we have the alveoli sac. That's the thing we're gonna focus about, and we have you take deoxygenated blood from pulmonary artery and oxygenated blood to pulmonary vein. And we have the respiratory, bronchial, and alveolus, and the the capillaries. I just wanted to show you what we're actually talking about, so you can actually get the idea. Now, and one thing you should know, the air path is nose to pharynx to trachea to bronchi, bronchioles, and alveoli. Okay, now we're moving to the lungs, right? So in the lungs are the two lungs are located in the chest and are protected by two pairs of ribs. Okay, and they are spongy and elastic, and they expand and contract when you breathe. And each lung is wrapped by a double membrane, which is called the pleura. So this also it is pronounced differently, but I feel like in South Africa I pronounce it American. So yeah, but yeah. So the fluid between the pleura stops friction when lungs move, cause we know friction. Kids who do physical sciences, they know that friction and all that. But let's not talk about that. Okay. So now we're going to the what? To the respiratory muscles. Then in the respiratory muscles, we have firstly we have the diaphragm. So the diaphragm is a dome-shaped muscle between chest and the abdomen. Okay, now the diaphragm contracts and flattens, altering the volume of the chest cavity, and is important for breathing. Now, in Turkey, this muscle, it is responsible, is the main muscle for what? For breathing. Now we're gonna go to the intercostal muscles. Now we have this intercostal muscles, they are between our ribs, right? Then we have the external and internal intercostal muscles. Now they contract and relax during inhalation or exhalation to change the chest cavity volume, right? Do you get what I'm saying? Okay. Then after that we have the ribs. The ribs, they are on both sides of the sternum, or you can say they are what? They are breastbone. They even taught you about the sternum last year, yeah, when you were doing the skeleton. Then they are on both sides of the sternum, and they protect lungs from injury. I'm sorry. So if you don't have the ribs, your lungs are prone to infection, to injuries, and all that. Now we're going to the diagram keywords, right? So these are the things you should know. You should know that the bronchial is a small airway tube. You should know that actually. You should know that a bronchial is a small airway tube. And alveoli are sacs for gas exchange. Arterial are small artery bringing the oxygenated blood in. Then we have the venule. We're not talking about the venule, we're talking about small vein taking oxygenated blood out. Then again, we're talking about the infundibulum. I told you we pronounce it differently. So it is a cluster of alveoli at the end of bronchial. Then lastly, we have the capillaries. Then when we're talking about the capillaries, we're talking about tiny blood vessels around the alveoli. Now let's do some quick memory trick, So the breathing, when we're talking about breathing, the diaphragm and intercostal muscles change chest volume, right? Then the lungs expand, air reaches alveoli, gas exchange in capillaries. I hope you heard everything, and make sure that you tune in for the following videos. It's Jim Billy signing out. I love you guys. Bye. Make sure you check out part 2 and more videos to follow. Make sure that you like, subscribe, so you don't miss any video that is life sciences related, because the Mega Billy Science class is a key to your distinction. I love you. Bye bye.